Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis and Mitzvah Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Ayin Tes Amid Aleph. Before we begin our learning should be a schos for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanusunu Batzara Bashivya, Ha'im Demein Bayam Omein Bayabasha, Ha'Malkaim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitziam Mitzara L'Rvacha, Me'afela La'ira U'Mishibad L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv V'Neimar Amein. Our learning should also be a schus refuah shalema for our real Yosef ben Miriam Rezel and Meir ben Chayisara. They should have refuah shalema b'sag shar chayla Yisrael. So today we are going to embark on a new Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin, and we're going to be discussing the very complex sugya of what foods are covered by HaMotzi on Pas when you eat a Suda. So you sit down to eat a Suda. You wash the Tilas Yadayim, you make HaMotzi on your pas, on your bread, on your challah, what have you. And our expectation is that once we have made a HaMotzi on pas, we're no longer going to be making any other brachas rishonahs. However, we're going to see that that's not so simple. Matter of fact, it's not simple at all. There's many machlokes involved, there's many machlokes poskim involved, and we'll see how deep and how detailed we can get. But in any case, we're going to do what we do best. And let's pick up now on Ayin Tes Amud Aleph, Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin, Dvarim Habayim B'Soich HaSeuda, foods that come as part of the Suda, V'Achar HaSeuda, as well as foods that come after the Seuda. Now let's remember, whenever we speak here in Halacha about Dvarim Habam La'achar HaSeuda, usually that's not very negeh to us. The practice back in the day was, at a certain point, the meal would be finished. At that point, between the end of the meal and berachah hamazon, benching, they would eat and drink certain foods, but they were not really considered part of the Suda. We've seen in the Mishnah Berurah many times already, where the Chavetz Chaim has said that generally speaking, does not apply to us, but will cross that bridge when we get to it. Says the Berurah Sif Aleph, Dvarim habaim b'soich haseuda, foods that come during the meal. Im heim dvarim habaim machmas haseuda, if they are foods that are coming as part of the Suda. The word machmas is usually and most simply translated into English as because of. What does that mean? That they come because of the Suda? They come because you're eating a meal. Why do you eat a meal? You eat a meal to satiate yourself. You eat a meal to nourish your guf. You eat a meal to fill yourself up. These are all the reasons why you eat a meal. So when we talk about dvarim aboyim machmas hasuda, we mean meal foods. These are meal foods that come to satiate and to nourish. So says the Mechaber, if these are things that come machmas hasuda, dahainu. What does this mean? Devarim shederech likbaya seuda aleihem. These are foods that you would be kaiveya seuda on. A steak is something that you eat for a suda. A potato kugel is a side dish that you eat as part of a suda. Somebody asks you, what did you have for supper? I had meat and potatoes. Somebody asks you, what did you have for supper? I had schnitzel and rice. I had schnitzel and corn. Somebody asks you, what did you have for supper? I had salmon and mashed potatoes. If somebody's going to ask you, what did you have for supper? You're not going to say, I had an apple. You didn't have an apple for supper. You're not even going to say, I had a delicious piece of grilled salmon and a gorgeous Macintosh apple. An apple is not dvar mabar machmas hasuda. It just isn't. Salmon, steak, schnitzel, mashed potatoes, potato kugel, corn, rice. These are all things that are dvar mabar machmas hasuda, that you would make a suda out of. You would make a suda out of these foods. The next words that the Mechaber says are it's phraseology that we're going to see again and again. He says these are foods that are lelafes pahem es hapas. Now, the easiest way to translate the word lelafes would mean to accompany. These are foods that accompany the bread as part of the Suda. Now, right away, I'm going to dive into the Bir Halacha, the first Bir Halacha here in this Siman, Bir Halacha Dibra Maschil Lelafes Behem Es HaPas. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ayin B'Tosfos, Mem Aleph Amud Beis in Masechtas Brachos Dibra Maschil Hilchasa, Talmidei Rabbeinu Yoina, Harash, Duadin Dvarim She'ein Derek Lelafes Ben Es HaPas. This doesn't necessarily mean that the Mechaber is telling you that Dvarim Haboim Machmas Hasuda means foods that you always eat as an accompaniment to bread. That's not necessarily true. Rak Sheboin Limozain Ulesoiva. What it means are, these are foods that are coming for nourishment and to satiate. Gam Kein B'Klal Dvarim Haboim Machmas Suda. These are also, all of these kind of foods are considered Dvarim Haboim Machmas Hasuda. When the Mechaber says over here, Hainu Dvarim Shederech Likbay Hasuda Aleim Lilafes Behem Es HaPas, he's not saying bedafka that these have to be foods that you would eat together with bread, as an accompaniment with bread. Nobody's going to eat potato kugel as an accompaniment to bread. Yet, potato kugel is a davar haba machmas hasuda. It is something that comes lemozain u'lesaiva. So it definitely is considered dvarim haba machmas hasuda, even though strictly speaking, it is not lelafis bayis hapas to accompany the bread. V'hamechaber kitzer bazeh. Chavetz Chaim says that the mechaber kedarka b'kodesh was trying to keep things short and sweet. If the Mechaber would write all the words that I just said, we would already be 6 pages in. So the Mechaber is keeping it short and sweet. There are those that want to suggest also that the words lelafes behem es hapas are not to be taken literally, that it means these are foods that accompany bread, meaning that they're typically eaten at the same time and simultaneously with bread. To accompany bread means we are keveya seuda al hapas. We know that, if mommy makes schnitzel for supper and somebody wants to eat only schnitzel, mommy will say, I'm sorry, you can't eat only schnitzel. Why? Because schnitzel is not going to fill you up. You need carbs. And carbs nowadays is a little bit of a dirty word in some circles. But you need carbs to fill you up. So the carbs back in the day, for the most part, was bread. So when you sit down to eat a meal, you eat bread, and then you eat a protein. You eat a meal food, like meat, like chicken, like fish. So, lelafes bayis hapas means that a meal essentially has 2 parts. There's the pas, but you're not going to make a meal out of pas alone. You're not just going to have bread for supper. So you're going to have bread and something else. What is the something else? The something else is the other part of the meal that is ba lelafes bayis hapas. It's coming to accompany the bread, meaning that the bread is one part of the meal, one ikar part of the meal, and this is the other ikar part of the meal. So again, for the sake of continuity, let's just read the Mechaber from the beginning. Devarim habayim b'sayich hasuda, foods that come in the middle of the Suda. So now it depends. Im heim dvarim habayim machmas hasuda. If these are foods that come as part of the Suda, they're meal foods. Dahainu dvarim shederech likbay hasuda aleim lelafes behem es hapas. These are foods that you would use as a meal food, as an accompaniment to the bread. Kigoin, for example, basar, meat, dogim, fish, ubeitzim, eggs, v'yerakos, vegetables, ugevina, cheese, v'daisa, cereals and porridges, umine meluchim, pickled foods, salted foods. Afilu oichlam b'loy pas, even if you eat them during the meal without bread, meaning you're not eating this together with the bread. You're not eating the potato kugel together with the bread. You're not eating salmon at the same time as bread. You're eating bread, you washed, you made HaMotzi, you're eating bread, and you ate some bread, and now you're eating salmon without the bread. You're eating the steak without the bread. You're eating the mashed potatoes without the bread. Afilu oichlam b'loy pas, even if you eat these foods without bread, ein tu'unin berachah lifneihem, you're not required to make a separate berachah rishonah on these foods. Why? The birkas HaMotzi peitrasan. Because, says the Mechaber, the berachah of HaMotzi patters these foods. Now that's a loaded 3 words. The berachah of HaMotzi patters these 3 foods. Now we're going to have to get into the weeds a little bit of the mechanics of exactly what that means. That the berachah of HaMotzi patters these foods, and it's going to make a significant nafkamina. So you don't have to make a berachah rishonah on these foods. So you washed, you made HaMotzi, you covered your steak, you covered your potato kugel, you covered your mashed potatoes, you covered your string beans, almondine, you covered your corn, you covered your rice, you covered all of these meal foods are covered with your HaMotzi. V'loy la'achareyim, nor are you going to make a separate berachah achrona on these foods. If you sat down to eat a steak without washing, without making HaMotzi on bread first, you would make a bar nefashos. You're not going to make a bar nefashos on your steak. The birkas hamazon peitrasan, because benching is going to patter the steak. Okay, let's break here for the moment, and let's go into the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut aleph, lelafis bahem. These are foods that the Mechaber said are lelafis bahem as a pas. They accompany bread. Now we already saw what the Chavetz Chaim wrote in the Berurah Halacha, that this is lav dafka. It doesn't mean that you eat these foods necessarily together with bread. And the Chavetz Chaim makes the same point over here in Mishnah Berurah's cut aleph. He says one of the foods that the Mechaber listed was daisa. Now what's daisa? So daisa is, picture some of the common hot cereals that we eat nowadays. Oatmeal. Oatmeal would be daisa. Wheatina would be daisa. Farina is probably daisa. The reason I'm putting a probably in front of farina is because over there, the cereal is very, very, very fine. It's almost like a flour. But I guess it would be called a daisa. So a daisa is a cooked porridge, a grain-based porridge. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'daisa, avshihi ava, it's thick. Ve'ena malafes b'mapas. You don't eat it together with bread. Right? V'nechal b'fnei atzmai. It's eaten on its own. Mikal makayim, nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, kevan sheba lahasbia, since it's a food which comes to satiate, it's a bona fide meal food, ikar seudahi, it's an ikar part component of the meal. V'nitfelas lahapas, and it is tuffle to the pas. Now, in those 2 words, v'nitfelas lahapas, I told you that we're going to have to get into the weeds of the mechanics of what it means over here that HaMotzi patters the other foods. So in the Mechaber, we saw the 3 words that I pointed out to you already, which is our the birkas HaMotzi peitrasan, that the berachah of HaMotzi patters all these other foods from a berachah rishonah. That's one concept. Now here in the Mishnah Berurah we have another concept, which is mikamakim kevin chabas lahasbia. The daisa, even though you're not eating it with bread, nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, it comes lahasbia. It's a bona fide meal food that's eaten to satiate. Therefore, ikar seudihi v'nitveles lahapas. It is a tuffle to the pas. Now, the mechanics, that points to the mechanics of ikar and tuffle. What we're saying is, you made a HaMotzi on the pas. All of the other meal foods are considered to be a tuffle to the pas. So once you made the bracha on that ikar, you no longer have to make the bracha on the tuffle. That's what we're seeing here right now. V'hu adin, and likewise, says the Chavetz Chaim, Kol mine tavshilin haragilin lavai l'sayich sudas hapas. He brings down from the Rush, so too, any other cooked dishes that are typically brought as part of a meal, those are all going to be patter. They're all going to be pattered by the HaMotzi. Okay. Weiter. Ice cotton base. Then the Mechaber made the point. He said these foods are pater from their own berachah rishonah, even if you eat them without pas. It's not, don't think that in order for these foods to be pater from berachah rishonah, you have to actually eat them together with pas. You do not, even if you don't eat them with pas. Ois cut and base, says the HaMotzi, beloy pas. The kevin chetamid boim lalafes is a pas, because since these are all always, they're typically and constantly and frequently eaten lalafes is a pas, as an accompaniment to a meal where you eat bread, may ikar asudahim. They're an ikar part of the suda, and again, v'nitfolim lahapas. And they are all considered a tuffle to the bread. So when you made HaMotzi on the ikar, you made HaMotzi on the bread, you pottered all the tfeilim. And all of these suda foods are considered tfeilim to the pas. So I just want to point out again, because it's going to be very negeya for a coming Mishnah Berurah. What we're seeing so far over here from the HaMotzi very clearly is that he is stressing the mechanism of ikar and tuffle. Why is your steak potter from a berachah shehakol? Because you made HaMotzi on the bread. The bread is the ikar, the steak is the tuffle. Why are your mashed potatoes potter from a berei priya adama? They're potter from a berei priya adama because you made HaMotzi on the pas. The pas is the ikar. The mashed potatoes are a tuffle. Now, some of you might be scratching your head, and you're saying to yourself, I washed on a roll. Okay, might have even been a good roll. I'm eating $160 steak. The bread is the ikar and the steak is the tuffle? I mean, if somebody asks me what I had for supper, I'm going to tell them I had a steak. Wow. They're not going to say, I had a roll, and together with that roll, I had a steak. So, sounds a little bit like off. Somehow the steak is a tuffle to the HaMotzi. So we're going to get into this. Ois cut and gimel. The Mechaber said that you don't have to make a berachah rishonah on any of these meal foods. The berachas HaMotzi paitrasa. And here's where we first get a little thorny. Says the HaMotzi. How about if you're not really in the mood of eating bread? Like I just said, you sat down to have your steak and fries. You washed. They gave you bread, so you washed. You had bread. Also, you know that there's a side benefit to washing and eating the bread. Once I wash and eat the bread, I took care of a lot of my suffix brachas. I don't have to worry about brachas rishonahs anymore. I washed, I made HaMotzi, I'm good. So there's like this halachic side benefit to washing and making HaMotzi. Rice, there's always a suffix. What bracha should I make on rice? Should I make a mezainis on rice? Should I make a adama on rice? Well, you know what? I washed, I made HaMotzi on bread. I took care of my sveikis. So there's a halachic side benefit to eating pas. Do I really want to eat pas? No, I'm not really coming here to eat bread. I'm coming here to eat a steak. So says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'yemenei chafetz lechel pas." What if you don't really want to eat bread? Ela oichel ma'at pas kidei lepotram. You washed essentially to gain the side benefit of pottering all the other foods from the bracha. I would say the same question might even come. You go to a restaurant, you go to a fancy restaurant. So the first thing that happens is you sit down and they offer you a couple of rolls with some garlic, with some olive oil with garlic and basil or something else. One of the reasons that's there is because they need you to be busy eating something while they're busy making your steak. They can't have you sitting there starved while you're waiting for your steak to come. So, okay, the truth is, again, the ikar over here seems to be the steak, not the roll that I'm going to eat at the beginning of the meal. So I think that's nichlal in the HaMotzi's question over here. He says, well, the Mishnah Berurah brings down from the Magen Avram and others, I always talk about how you see the HaMotzi, how he gives very, very great preference always to the Magen Avram. He brings down from the Magen Avram, Kasrach Roidim, Diyesh Lehistapek, Yachal Patram. The Magen Avram is very mesupik. Really? The bread over here is going to potter everything else? How? Ikar and tuffle? It's going to potter all the other food? How could you say that all the other foods are a tuffle to the pas. He doesn't even want to eat the pas. So the tomahawk steak is a tuffle to the pas? How does that happen? He doesn't even want to eat the pas. The choshken kishach rak pakas b'kazayis. Sometimes what happens even is somebody washes and he doesn't even eat a kazayis of the pas. If you didn't eat a kazayis of the pas, then that achila is not even nechshav as an achila. So you're telling me that a guy ate less than a kazayis of pas, and somehow he pottered the steak and the fries and everything else from a berachah because he had less than a kazayis of pas? It doesn't work. So that's one side of the Magen Avram's suffix. One side of his suffix doesn't seem to make sense to me. How could it be that the pas is going to pater everything else if the guy doesn't even want to eat the pas? Oy ulai, or the Magen Avram throws out another tzad. He says maybe kevan the derech oilam likbaya suda alapas. It is the derech of the Welt. It's the derech of the world to be kaveh suda alapas. Pas is like, what do they call pas? The staff of life, right? Pas is like the mainstay. It's a little bit like what we said by wine. Wine is rosh v'rishain l'chal hamashkim. Now, wine is going to be rosh v'rishain l'chal hamashkim, even if you make a bar priya gofen on very standard issue Concord grape, and then they go ahead and they bring you some kind of a special edition numbered bottle of beer from a boutique brewery. Doesn't matter. The Concord grape is wine. Wine is rosh v'rishain l'chal hamashkim. Bread is the mainstay of the meal. Once you eat bread, once you make HaMotzi on the pas, that is by default the ikar. It doesn't matter, even though you don't really even want to eat it. You're not makshav it so much, but it doesn't matter. You made HaMotzi on pas. The way of the world is that pas is the ikar of kviyas suda, and therefore it paters everything else. Ayulai came into derech oilam by a suda la pas, because a pas by trusted b'chol gavni. Okay, so the Magen Avram has this suffix. So now what do we do with this suffix? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Valkain, and therefore, because of this suffix, Kasvu the Achrayim right, in such a case, when you're washing and you're making HaMotzi and you're only eating a little bread, you don't even really want the bread. Maybe you're only having the bread because you thought it was going to pater all the other brachas. Toiv yoser, it would be better, right, the Achrayim, sheyavarich al sha'ari dvarim habracha re'uya l'chalachas, that you should make the proper bracha rishonah on all the other foods. You should make a shakel on the steak. You should make a adam on the potatoes. You should make a mezainis. If there's a pasta side dish, you should make all of the brachas. V'lo yochel pas klal, and don't wash and eat bread. So you hear what he's saying over here? He's saying that because of this suffix of the Magen Avram, you don't really want to eat pas. You're only going to eat a very small amount of pas. You only wanted to have the pas kidei to pater the rice from its bracha. Better don't wash, don't eat pas, leave it out. Don't get yourself into the suffix. Make all of your brachas rishonahs in loy b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov, unless you're talking about Shabbos and Yom Tov. Why? Because the Oz mitzvah lechol kazayis pas. Because by Sudas Yom Tov, Sudas Shabbos, you have a separate mitzvah to eat a kazayis pas. So then choshevu. Then automatically the achilas hapas is choshev, v'nasa kol tfeilim loy. Since there's a mitzvah to eat pas, everything else becomes a tuffle to the pas. So this is like, I think to most people, this Mishnah Berurah would be an astonishing chiddush. So again, and then I want to show you what the Aruch HaShulchan has to say on this. But again, just to recap, what's the suffix of the Magen Avram? We're saying over here, davar pashut, that you wash, you make HaMotzi on bread. The HaMotzi on bread is going to pater all of the other dvarim aboyim machmas hasuda. The mechanics that we have seen so far, that the Mishnah Berurah has spoken about, have been ikar and tuffle. Now, I would just mention that, like I showed you in the Mechaber's words were the berkas HaMotzi paitrosan. The bracha of HaMotzi paters all the other foods. Now, that doesn't exclude the mechanics of ikar and tuffle. If the Mishnah Berurah wants to hinge himself to Iker and Tafel, so the Mishnah Berurah could say, yes, that's what the Mechaber means. What the Mechaber means is, you made a HaMotzi on the pas, which is the Iker, therefore you pattered all the other foods, which are Tfeilim. But very clearly we see that that's the mechanics that the Mishnah Berurah is going with. He's going with the mechanics in Iker and Tafel. Now, because we're going with the mechanics of Iker and Tafel, comes the Magen Avram with a suffix. The Magen Avram says, what do you do in a case where the bread simply does not seem to be the Iker? The tomahawk steak seems to be the Iker, not the little roll that they gave you. Or maybe it's a davar pashut that I'm not even making HaMotzi on the roll because I don't want to eat the roll. I don't really even want to eat the roll. I'm like, oh yeah, you know what, I'll eat some bread, that way I pater everything else from a berachah. So you don't even want to eat the roll. Right? In that case, the Magen Avram says, I have a suffix. I don't know what to do. Do we say, Lamaisa, you ate bread, and Lamaisa, the derech ha'olam is to be kaveh suda la pas, and pas is the Iker, and therefore, yes, you pater everything with the berachah on the pas? Or do I look at the facts on the ground and say, what kind of Iker and Tafel? How is the pas the Iker and everything else the Tafel? Says the Magen Avram, I have a suffix. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no, you have a suffix, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't get into the suffix. Don't wash and make HaMotzi on pasa under those circumstances. Leave the bread out. Don't eat the bread. And make a shakel on the steak and make all the other necessary brachas. That's where we are in the Mishnah Berurah. Comes along the Aruch HaShulchan, and everybody who's listened to this share for a while knows my feelings on the Aruch HaShulchan. I love the clarkite of the Aruch HaShulchan. So says the Aruch HaShulchan Azoi. Hapas poiter kol mine ma'acholim habayim b'sar chasuda hashayachim lahasuda. The berachah rishonah on pas paters all of the other foods that come during the suda that are shayachim l'suda, that are suda foods. V'hainu dvarim shederek l'kvaya suda aleib l'lavis benas hapas. These are meal foods that accompany bread. So far, like the Mechaber. Kemoi, basar, dagim, beitzim, yerakos, chema, dairy foods, gevina, cheese, chalav, milk, daisa, porridges, v'chol mine tavshilin, all sorts of cooked dishes, shehein l'shem achila usvia, that are brought to satiate for achila purposes and to nourish. V'chein kol mine meluchim, also all sorts of pickled foods, cured foods. Now comes the main point here that I'm bringing you from the Aruch HaShulchan. Va'afilu oichlon b'loi pas, we saw this in the Mechaber, and we saw it in the Mishnah Berurah. Even if you eat these foods without bread, right? We said, you're not eating the mashed potatoes with the bread. You're not eating the salmon simultaneously with the bread. Even if you don't eat them with the bread, ein tu'unin bracha lifneim, you still don't need a bracha rishonah, the berachas HaMotzi patrasam, because the bracha of HaMotzi still paters them, v'loy lachreim, and you don't need a separate bracha achrona, the berachas HaMazon patrasam. Now, listen closely. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, Oisam sheha'adam, what did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said, you should know you don't have to make a bracha rishonah on any of these foods. Then the Mechaber told you what seems to be a chiddush. You don't have to make a separate bracha rishonah on these foods, even if you do not eat them simultaneously with bread. Right? Look at the Mechaber. I want to make sure you cop this. Look at the Mechaber. He said, Dvarim abam b'sar chasuda, all of these foods, they don't need a separate bracha rishonah. Then he said, Afilu oichlam b'loi pas, even if you eat them without bread, ein tunim bracha lifteim. They don't need a bracha before them. Why? The berachas HaMotzi patrasam, because the bracha of HaMotzi paters. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, Oisam sheha'adam oichel im hapas, anything that you're gonna eat during the Suda simultaneously with bread, okay? Anything you're gonna eat at the same time as bread, together with bread, einanu tzrichim letam the berachas HaMotzi paitrasan. We don't need to say that the reason that's pater from a bracha is because the bracha of HaMotzi patered it. What the Aruch HaShulchan is saying, he's saying it like this. If you cut a piece of your steak and you eat it together with the bread, then the reason it's pater from a bracha rishonah is not because the bracha of HaMotzi patered the steak. The reason the steak is pater from a bracha rishonah is because it doesn't need one. You know why it doesn't need one? Because you're eating it together with bread. Since you're eating it together with bread, it is a tuffle to the bread. If you eat the mashed potatoes together with bread, then the reason the mashed potatoes don't need a bracha is because it's a tuffle to the bread. You're eating it with the bread, not because the bracha of HaMotzi patered it. Shaharei peturim heim mitam ikar v'tuffel. If anything that you eat together with a piece of bread, the mechanics of why that thing does not need a bracha rishonah is ikar and tuffel. Elatam de berachas HaMotzi la'oisam shene'echalim b'loi pas. When do I need what the Mechaber said? The berachas HaMotzi paitrasan? Exactly when the Mechaber said it. The Mechaber said, afilu oichalam b'loi pas. Even if you eat these foods without bread, ain tu'unim bracha lefneim, they don't need a separate bracha rishonah. Why? The berachas HaMotzi paitrasan. Because the bracha of HaMotzi paters them. That's a different mechanic, says the Aruch HaShulchan. V'nimtza, it comes out, sheshnei peturim yesh. There are two different mechanics at work here. Ha'echad, one mechanic is, masha pas pater, foods that the pas paters, v'hainu ha'machalim she'ochlim pasi moim. Those are the foods that you eat together with the bread, v'aptoru misham ikar v'tuffel. That's the mechanics of ikar and tuffel. V'asheni, the second mechanic that's at work over here in this siman, is masha berachas HaMotzi paiteres. Are the foods that the bracha of HaMotzi covers. V'hainu kol shebaim l'shem achilu usvia, any food that comes to nourish and to satiate, which is roiv tavshilin shalanu, most of our cooked dishes, shehein ikar asuda, that make up the main part of the meal. So you hear what the Aruch HaShulchan is saying? The Aruch HaShulchan is saying, he's basing this on a Tosfos on Mem Aleph Amud Beis. The Aruch HaShulchan is saying you need to realize that there are two different mechanics at play over here. When we say that HaMotzi on pas paters all the other foods. One is ikar and tuffel. When is ikar and tuffel at play? Says the Aruch HaShulchan, ikar and tuffel is only at play when you're eating the food that you're eating together with bread. When you eat the food together with bread, then that food becomes a tuffle to the bread. Indeed, we're going to see that even foods that typically do need a separate bracha rishonah during a meal. You eat an apple in the middle of the meal, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say you have to make a berachah on the apple, even though you washed it and you made a HaMotzi. But if you eat the apple together with bread, you don't have to make a berachah. Why? Because it's tuffle to the bread. Ice cream. We're going to say that ice cream pashtus needs a separate bracha rishonah when you eat it by the meal. But if you eat your ice cream together with bread, it doesn't. Why? Because then it's a tuffle to the bread. So says Aruch HaShulchan, that's one set of mechanics. But then there's a different set of mechanics. Then there's a set of mechanics which is what is covered by the bracha of HaMotzi. You thought that HaMotzi only covers pas. You're wrong. HaMotzi, says Aruch HaShulchan, covers any type of food that is a meal food. Any kind of food that comes to be a significant part of the meal. Normally, you make a shakal on a steak. But if you kaveh sud ala pas, and you make HaMotzi on the pas, the HaMotzi is also a bracha on the steak. Now, sounds like a huge kiddush? No. You make a gofen on yayin. Yayin is rosh v'rishon l'chol ha'mashkim. You drink a beer in the middle of the suda, you potted it with the hagofen. How did you pater it with the hagofen? Because the berachas hagofen covers the beer. Once the hagofen covers the rosh v'rishon l'chol ha'mashkim, it covers all the other mashkim. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, once you make HaMotzi on pas, HaMotzi covers the steak. Now, Where does this come back to us, to what we learned today? Says Yarach HaShulchan, Ulefizeh, according to what I just told you, Masher Isi, this that I have seen, a Magen Avram, Misha Mistapek, who has a suffix, Demein Cheftzei Lechal Arbe Pas Besudazu. If you don't really want to eat bread by this Suda, Vayikamat Pas, you ate a little bit of bread, but you didn't even really want to eat the bread. Im Peturim HaMacholim Mibracha, does it still pater the other foods from a bracha, right? The Magen Avram Safek. You didn't really want to eat bread. Does the HaMotzi still pater you from a shackle on the steak? The Magen Avram was Mesupik. The Mishnah Berurah said, get out of the Safek. Don't wash, don't eat bread. Says Yarach HaShulchan, this that I see that some people are Mesupik, Levishain Ritzaina Lechel Pas Harbe, because you don't even want to eat the pas. Ein Bazeh Mishum Safek. Yarach HaShulchan says, no Safek. No Safek. If we were working only with the mechanics of Iker and Tuffle, and the only way we could pater the steak is because you want to eat the pas, so now the steak is a Tuffle to the pas, so then chopper b'safkina bazeh. So then I see room for a suffix. Avalapturu mitam berachas HaMotzi. Says the Yarach HaShulchan, but you're forgetting something. The berachah of HaMotzi is what's patering the steak. And once you eat bread, you're allowed to make HaMotzi, even if the HaMotzi is not the ikr. But you made HaMotzi. HaMotzi is going to cover the steak. Gamkein, v'kevin shebirach HaMotzi, once you make HaMotzi, nifteru kol ha'machalim abayim machmas hasuda. All of the meal foods are covered by the HaMotzi. Afilu achal pas rak kizayis. Even if you only ate a kazayas, but a kazayas you have to eat. The pakas bekazayas any yakal of arch berachas hamazon. After all, you're not even going to be able to bench if you don't eat a kazayas. V'herei gam lam ha'acholam anum tzrikim leberachas hamazon lepoitron mi berachas hakarayna kamacha kasavnu. And we need you to be able to bench because you're going to pater all these other foods with benching. So a kazayas you have to eat. And he says the kama ashirim. We know lots of wealthy people, shema'acholim pas muat, who only eat a little bread by their meal, and everything else that they eat the steak and everything else. Do they have a different halacha than everybody else? No. So the Yarach HaShulchan is not maskim to this suffix of the Magen Avram, and I think this is more the way the Welt Ferzach, that once you make the HaMotzi, as long as you're going to eat a kazayas of pas, which you always should be careful to make sure you eat a kazayas of pas, because if you don't, you're going to get yourself in trouble with benching. You're going to get yourself in trouble with berachas hakaraynos. Make sure you eat a kazayas of pas after you wash. And don't wait. Wash, make HaMotzi, eat a kazayas of pas. That way you get yourself out of your shilos. But once you eat a kazayas of pas, the HaMotzi is going to pater all of the other foods that are considered meal foods. Okay. I was hoping to do Sif Dalet too, but I'm not going to be able to now. So we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Dalet, which is going to get us into a whole slew of other complexities when it comes to desserts, etc., etc. But we'll stop here for now. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be made in against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua Sefuras Parnas and Sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Geula Shleima with the Bias Koel Tzedek b'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.